Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Ken Coleman. I'm the director of the Center for Political Studies at the Institute for Social Research, and I'm delighted that you could join us today for this installment of the ISR Insights Speaker Series. For those of you who happen to be unfamiliar with ISR has over 300 affiliated faculty who, along with ISR's excellent staff, conduct research that addresses topics such as wealth and inequality, race and racism, politics and public opinion, as well as a wide range of other topics including teen drug use, economic behavior, aging, and health. Our faculty come from almost every school and college at the University of Michigan, reflecting the true interdisciplinary nature of our work. The goal of our ISR Insights Speaker Series is to create a forum for the dissemination of research findings from our faculty at ISR for the public good. All recordings of these events are posted on the ISR website, and we'll post information on upcoming talks there and on our social media channels. So please check those places to stay connected. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. Our first speaker will be Michael Traugott. He's a professor emeritus of political science and communication and a research professor emeritus with the Center for Political Studies. He studies campaigns and elections, voting behavior, political communication, the use of polls to construct news, and survey methodology. And he has published extensively in all of these areas. He is active in the American Association for Public Opinion Research and the World Association for Public Opinion Research. He has served as president of both organizations. He's a frequent resource for journalists interested in discussing American political campaigns and government operations. Our second speaker will be Josh Pasek. He is associate professor of communication and political science and faculty associate in the Center for Political Studies and core faculty for the Michigan Institute for Data Science at the university. His research explores how new media and psychological processes shape political attitudes, public opinion, and political behaviors. Our third speaker will be Stuart Soroka, and he's the Michael W. Traugott Collegiate Professor of Communication and Media and Political Science, and research professor in the Center for Political Studies. His research focuses on political communication, the sources and/or structure of public preferences for policy, and the relationships between public policy, public opinion, and mass media. Our presenters will discuss the latest polling and public opinion results from the months leading up to the election. They will also present highlights from The Breakthrough, a collaborative project that surveys Americans each week to ask what they remember hearing about the presidential candidates. Their project builds on research conducted leading up to the 2016 presidential election, which culminated in the publication of a book, Words That Matter: How the News and Social Media Shaped the 2016 Presidential Campaign. I want to note that we are providing live captioning of this event, and you can view those captions by turning on the closed captioning feature on your screen. Also, we will have Q&A at the end of the presentations. You'll notice that the chat feature is disabled for this event. So I invite you to send in any questions you have through the Q&A feature of Zoom. You can send your questions in throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer them before our time ends. Thank you again for joining us today. Enjoy the presentation. I will now turn things over to our speaker. Mike?
Thank you, Ken. And thank you, everybody who has signed in today for the presentations. Let me begin. This is a very interesting and unusual election that we're experiencing in the United States today. I want to begin by just mentioning a few highlights about the Trump presidency. First of all, Donald Trump had no prior experience in governing. He ran explicitly as an outsider, promising to drain the swamp. He has little interest in policy, formation, legislation. Some journalists have described the Trump presidency as post-policy government. He doesn't believe in science, and often he governs from very instinctive gut feelings. And of course, he has been known to stretch the truth and sometimes even to lie. He is atypically focused on his base, unlike any other first-term president recently, who takes office and thinks about how to enlarge his coalition. One thing that's different about the 2020 election is that, of course, Donald Trump is now an incumbent. He has a record to defend. And he had a campaign strategy pre-COVID, which was to run on a strong economy and to turn out his base. But of course, the onset of COVID has altered things dramatically. When political scientists think about how to understand elections, there are four basic features that they look at. One of them is the division of partisanship in the constituency. Another is how the candidates are being evaluated as individuals. A third is what are the main policy differences between the candidates. And of course, there's always an emphasis on turnout and whether it will differ by party or by supporters of the candidates. One thing that's important to recognize about the United States, thinking about a national constituency and the popular vote, is that it's a democratic government. That is, there are more Democrats in the adult citizenry than there are Republicans. These are data across 25 years or so from the Pew Research Center, looking at party identification, a concept that was developed at the Institute for Social Research. You can see in the top line, this question is asked in two parts. The first is, do you think of yourself as a Democrat, Republican, or Independent? In the latest measures, there are about as many independents as Democrats. Both of these groups outnumber the Republicans. But if in a second question, the independents are asked whether they lean more towards the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, you can see that in the contemporary United States, there are more Democrats than Republicans by about 5 percentage points. But one thing that's important to recognize about these distributions is that there are very substantial racial and ethnic differences in party support. Among whites, the Republicans are the favored party, the more partisans, but among blacks, Democrats are outnumbered by 8 to 1, among Hispanics by a little more than 2 to 1, and among Asian Americans, about 5 to 1. And it's not just the standing status of partisanship in the United States. The demography of the US is that whites are going to become a minority in the population by the mid-2040s. So there's a significant question about what it means to be a Republican or a Democrat in today's society and how that is likely to change across the next 20 or 25 years. I mentioned something about personal assessments. We call these traits, and these are data from a recent Pew survey last week. And you can see that Joe Biden is more likely to be seen as compassionate than Donald Trump. He has a 33 percentage point advantage, a good role model, a 26 percentage point advantage, honest, an 18 percentage point advantage, and courageous. The only place where Donald Trump stands up for what he believes in, where he has an 8 percentage point advantage. If we turn to candidate evaluations on policy, where the question is, how confident are you that either Biden or Trump makes good decisions in the following area? The only place where they're about even is with regard to making good decisions about economic policy. Trump has an invisible 1 percentage point advantage. But then as we move down through a series of social issues, effectively handle law enforcement and criminal justice, select good nominees for the Supreme Court, make good decisions about foreign policy, Biden has a growing advantage. I've highlighted these with blue arrows and red arrows using the traditional Democratic and Republican colors. for the item, bring the country closer together, Joe Biden has a 20 percentage point advantage. I want to emphasize the racial and ethnic differences in party identification and support by candidates by showing you some data about the distribution of white voters in presidential elections going back to 1976. The Republican candidate has been supported by white voters by an average margin of about 14 percentage points. It got closest in the election of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in 1992. In 2012, there was a 20-point advantage for Mitt Romney over Barack Obama. And these differences by party and race and ethnicity persist into the most current polling data. These are again data from a survey last week from Pew Research Center. And you can see that among whites, Donald Trump is the preferred candidate by 51 to 44 percentage points, while Joe Biden is the preferred candidate, for example, among blacks by 89 to 8 percentage points. If we look at the current standing of the race, we have to do this two ways. One of them is, of course, in terms of the national vote. This is a chart that's taken from 538. It shows, as of this morning, Joe Biden has a 10.6 percentage point lead based upon Nate Silver's model over Donald Trump. But we know that in two of the last 5 elections, the president who didn't get the most votes took office because of the Electoral College. And so we have to pay attention to who's leading in the battleground states. And here you can see that Joe Biden has an advantage currently in 7 of them, including the upper Midwest, whereas Donald Trump has an advantage in Texas, and Georgia is currently too close to call, but with a slight advantage for Donald Trump. And this is the most important thing to track in the remaining 2 weeks of the campaign. It's also important because this is an issue in the current campaign under the shadow of the pandemic, about differences in preference by voting method. These are also from the most recent Pew survey. Among everybody surveyed, there's a 10 percentage point lead for Joe Biden, but among people who say that they're going to vote in person on election day, Donald Trump is ahead by 2 to 1. But among those who are going to vote by mail, Joe Biden has an advantage 69 to 27%. And among those who vote in person before election day, early voting, he has a lead of 55 to 40%. This is part of what underlies the contest about voting methods, especially the claims by Donald Trump about the illegality of voting by mail. It's important to recognize that I think that as of this morning, there are about 12 million votes already cast in this election. So what are the candidates' basic strategies? For Donald Trump, he's always emphasized his base, and he's trying to energize them to vote by appealing to racial and ethnic divisions in society, these so-called wedge issues. His campaign has very minimal policy content. His party and his own campaign are actively engaged in trying to suppress turnout, and he's questioning the validity of balloting and the outcome of the election by type of votes cast. Joe Biden is trying to remain positive and empathetic, which I think is an essential part of his personality. And he's emphasizing personality differences with the president. He's promoting some policies, for example, like the environment or policies related to dealing with climate change, but he doesn't do this by promoting detailed contrast with Trump's policies. And the Democrats in general are emphasizing turnout, voting in large numbers. The Trump administration, Donald Trump, has been successful in sowing doubt about the integrity of the electoral system. These are data from a few weeks ago collected by YouGov for Yahoo News. And they show the partisan difference in attitudes about whether or not the election will be rigged or not. And you can see that for the first three items, for the first two items, Republicans are much more likely to believe that bad things are going to happen with vote counting and irregularities. Democrats are more likely to say yes, that election security experts say a US presidential election cannot be rigged. Do you believe them? But you can see that that percentage only ranges between 15 for Republicans and 29 for Democrats. And I think the most disheartening part of this is that when respondents were asked, do you think this year's presidential election will be free and fair? Only about a quarter of the respondents said yes. Those are my comments, and now I will turn it over to Josh.
All right, thank you, Mike. Let me share my own screen, and then I will give you a slightly overlapping set of stories that I see as sort of the various narratives of the 2020 presidential election campaign. And sort of an overarching question that I have for it is the extent to which it's reasonable at this point to treat this like a normal election year, or whether we need to think about it somewhat differently. And so in practice, we're 20 days out from this election. Where do we stand? Well, there's sort of four different ways that I think you can reasonably look at this as a scholar. One is looking at the state of the race itself, and I'll talk through a little bit more of that as well. I'll talk through each of these. Another is looking at some of the structural features that are in play that are setting up the landscape on which the current election is taking place. A third is looking at the messaging that people are getting in the context of this campaign. And the fourth is really thinking a little bit more broadly about where we are currently in the American political system and what that might imply. And so starting then with the state of the race, right, here is the current map, as it were, of the most recent polling in various states. So as of right now, as you can see from this, Biden is currently polling ahead in enough states that he seems likely to be the winner based on the map itself. The blue wall states that Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 that were presumed to be sort of required for a Democrat to win, of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, he is ahead in all three. And he seems to be quite competitive in a number of states that are must-wins for Trump, but that he or that both candidates are nearly even in, like Ohio and Florida at the moment. Where does this lead us to in terms of forecasts? Well, if you take the 538 forecast at the moment, right now, the most likely option based on the polling and based on the couple of other factors they add is that it's going to be a little less than 350 electoral votes for Joe Biden, well more than the 270 needed to win the election. And notably, that's been fairly stable over time in terms of what the estimate's been, though it's at its high end at the moment. Also, it's worth noting that about 10% of the people who voted in 2016, of the proportion or the number of people who voted in 2016, have already had their ballots accepted by election officials. So this is a map showing that in states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Florida as well, almost 20% of the total 2016 turnout number has already been recorded as getting their ballots in. And so that's indicative perhaps of a very high turnout election. It also likely has a lot to do with the pandemic, but it signifies this position where many votes are already being cast, and the current landscape may have guided votes even if people would have hypothetically changed their evaluations later in the process. There are some notable things that are not pointing quite as strongly toward a Biden win, however. One of which is that the Democrats have almost no field operation in the current in the current cycle. They're not going out and knocking doors on the presidential level. That's something that the Biden campaign decided not to do. And that's in contrast to around 300 field offices for Get Out the Vote for the Republicans. And so structurally, there is this potential that Republicans are going to do a lot more door knocking and potentially get more people out on election day, which has been a bit of their plan as well. Additionally, there's current differences in advertising. So while early in this cycle, it was the case that the Trump campaign actually had considerably more funding and was advertising more almost everywhere. That switched beginning in around August. And the Biden campaign has tended to dominate, in particular, cable and broadcast television ads, but also to a somewhat lesser extent, and not so in the last couple weeks, spending on Facebook as well. And so the advertising game has been a bit of a mixed bag in this election, but one that suggests that indeed, the Biden campaign is sort of a little ahead at the moment. Okay, what's the backdrop that all of this is happening underneath? Well, structurally, we've had a president who's never had a net favorability in the American public. A majority, or at least a plurality of individuals who've ever been asked the sort of net approval, or whether they approve or disapprove of the president's job, have said that they do not approve. And that has been a rather consistent feature of this presidency. It points as well to what Mike was talking about with the fact that he's been playing very heavily toward his own base and not toward creating a larger coalition. This is very unusual. Usually approval is strongly correlated with re-election chances, and an approval rate of 44% would not be associated with re-election. But it's also an unusual way to target oneself as a sitting president, who typically try to represent all the American people and to gain favorability among all of them. The economic situation, which is one of the other major indicators that political scientists look for, is relatively poor at the moment. COVID did not treat the US economy well, and the economic growth in the last 2 quarters that we have are numbers that are strongly negative, and strongly negative numbers there tend again to be something that point against re-election of an incumbent president. There is, however, as Mike also noted, a Republican structural advantage in certain ways, in that it is not inconceivable that the Republicans could lose a majority of the votes and yet still win the Electoral College. Overall, the Electoral College tends in general to sort of magnify the win size for whoever does win, in the sense that there are a bunch of states that are reasonably good approximations of the country as a whole, and that whoever wins those states gets a whole lot of electoral votes for only a few percentage points of popular vote shift. But the Republicans have a distinct advantage at the moment structurally on that, in that most of those states are just a little bit more conservative leaning than the country as a whole. And so that means that it's easier for Republicans to win the Electoral College while losing the popular vote, which reflects what we've seen over the last 20 or so years. The third sort of narrative that we can tell about the election is about messaging, right? And that's a narrative where, you know, we actually have incredible stability in this cycle. It's quite frequent that you see the polls for the 2 candidates jump up and down a little bit and cross over one another over the course of the cycle, depending on what happens in conventions and debates. We largely haven't seen that this year. It's been a very stable campaign in terms of the relative positioning of the 2 candidates with regard to vote preferences. Maybe it's widened a pinch more recently, but no huge differences there. There's also been relatively stable, at least in the way that we tend to think of it, attention to issues across the campaign. Yes, there are things that pop up over the course of a campaign that people are paying attention to that differ, right? When Joe Biden is picking a vice presidential nominee in Kamala Harris, right? There's more attention to that. But people tend to say that they're hearing essentially the same things that they were hearing back in June and July, though at a slightly greater overall magnitude. This is actually from data that all three of us have been collecting as part of a project we call the Breakthrough that's been with CNN and with something called the Social Science Social Media Collaborative. And we've been asking people in surveys what they've seen, read, or heard about both Biden and Trump. Every day we ask about 100 and change people what they've seen, read, or heard, and those individual responses we aggregate and figure out, well, what are they talking about? Are they talking about coronavirus? Are they talking about the debates, et cetera? For Trump, there's been a little bit more, sorry, I did not, yeah, sorry. For Trump, there's been a little bit more variation in this. He's brought up a few more different topics over the course of the election. But still, it's been a story largely of stability. The biggest deviations for that are are the conventions, are his nomination of a new Supreme Court nominee, the debates, and the fact that he recently got coronavirus. Okay, so that's sort of the typical set of narratives around the election, but I want to suggest that there's another story that needs to be attended to, which is this moment in American politics, right? We are at a moment where there's increasing animosity in American politics. That is, Democrats tend to dislike Republicans more than they used to. Republicans tend to dislike Democrats more than they used to. That shift is coupled with an increase in institutional distrust. This is particularly notable looking at Republicans in the media, but if you look at basically any institution you can name in American society, levels of trust are lower than they had been. Partisanship itself is increasingly racialized, and that's not just in the sense that whites and blacks increasingly diverge in the parties that they're part of, but a lot of attitudes that people have increasingly correspond with their racial attitudes. And that is whether they essentially dislike or like people of different races. And so we've seen an increasing correlation between racial resentment, which is a measure of that, and things like ideology, presidential voting, party identification, attitudes toward healthcare, et cetera, over time, which creates a space where things can get much more acrimonious. There's been an increasing erosion of key democratic norms. Americans are less likely to reject political violence than they were even in 2017. Unfortunately, we don't have great consistent data going back on this, but these numbers have gone down, that it's sometimes okay. Seems to be a narrative among an increasing number of Americans. And then we have the sort of changes that are occurring at the moment with delays in mail-in ballots, with worries about how changing the structure of how people are voting is going to introduce more errors into the process potentially. More votes are going to be rejected because signatures don't match this year, because people aren't doing it the same way when they're doing it by mail as they were when they were doing it in person. And mail-in voting has increased a lot. There's also been things that are even more concerning, such as questions about whether the president is willing to accept the election results or actually engage in a peaceful transition of power if he indeed does lose. And some evidence that groups have been recruiting people to show up at the polls quite likely aren't, which could be sort of a widespread attempt at voter suppression. And of course, there are things like, the conspiracy that we recently heard about for the governor in this state, where there is a political climate where that kind of stuff seems to be happening or discussed more and more. And that's a very risky political climate. And so maybe that all points to a situation where things are a little bit more abnormal, and we really do need to worry about whether the models are right, not just because the models sometimes have error, but because there actually is enough distrust in the system that people may work against it. So what should we expect here? Well, if we were looking at a normal election year, I'd say the signs point not overwhelmingly, but pretty heavily toward this being a change election. That people tend not to be particularly happy when they don't like the president overall, and when the economy's poor and polling fits in line with that pretty clearly. But given some of these unique contextual features of the campaign, I don't know that the technical results of the election, even if it falls the way we would expect, is going to be the end of the story. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Soroka.
Hi, I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, so thank you very much, Mike and Josh, for kind of setting context. I get to skip all the details of the campaign and jump right into some data analysis. So what I want to do is start with these data that are focused on what the public recalls about reading about each of the candidates. Now, this graphic is based on survey data gathered in conjunction with colleagues here at Georgetown, CNN, and SRS. This is the breakthrough group that Josh spoke about, and they're pretty unique survey data. We ask whether respondents have read, seen, or heard anything in the last week about the candidate. And if they say yes, then we ask what. Now, this graphic is an analysis of those open-ended responses. Now, respondents can and do say anything they like. And here what we've done is use automated content analysis to try to assign a sentiment to each of the responses and then track trends in that sentiment over time. Now, note that this is not the sentiment of news content itself. It's the sentiment of the content that respondents remember. It's a different, but we think equally interesting and certainly more unique quantity. And the measure that we're looking at here is the percentage point difference in positive recollections versus negative recollections. The lines are drawn wide to show 95% confidence intervals. And what we see is a fair bit of stability over time, with a slightly positive average for Biden and a slightly negative average for Trump. This makes sense given what we know about public support for the candidates over the campaign, given the data that we've just seen in the preceding two presentations. But it also hides a fair bit of heterogeneity in recollections amongst partisans. Here, for instance, is the same trend, but amongst Democratic respondents only. The gap, obviously, is much wider, and here we see a slow increase in positivity for Biden, at least since Labor Day, and sort of a steady levels of negativity for Trump. But this is what the trends look like amongst Republicans. Now, Trump gets more positive recollections than Biden here, although there is a period in late August where the two are not so far apart. And over the past month or so, recollections of Trump have been a little more, not less, positive, albeit with a slight and statistically insignificant decline over the last month. Now, that's an interesting result because it runs contrary to what media observers might suggest, and certainly contrary to what the Trump campaign's own claims about negative coverage of Trump in mainstream media. Why do Republicans have largely positive recollections of Trump news? Now, part of this is about bias in these open-ended survey responses. Some of this is about respondents getting their news from different places. And some of it is about respondents' inclination to interpret the same information differently. And all of that is reflected in this graphic, which shows the impact of COVID-related content on the sentiment measures we were just looking at. This graphic focuses on the impact of COVID content on recollections of Trump news for Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And it shows pretty strikingly, I think, that even as COVID-related content is associated with negative sentiment amongst Democrats, it's associated with increasingly positive sentiment amongst Republicans. That trend is not just the product of Trump's apparent quick recovery in the week of October 11th, it's evident in weeks prior to that as well. In short, partisans see the same information, often in fundamentally different ways. Which is, I think, part of what makes this next set of slides interesting. I want to switch now to analyses of news content. And this graphic shows the ratio of Republican candidate mentions to Democratic candidate mentions over the first 3 weeks of September in all news content across 11 major newspapers for every election back to 1980. Now, the imbalance is reflected in the placement of the dots above or below the midpoint. That dotted line would be equal coverage between the two candidates. So distance from the midpoint matters, and it's also emphasized with the size of those dots. Now, the trends that I see here are as follows. Incumbents get more coverage than challengers, And this has been equally true for both parties, right? So we see this for Reagan, we see it for Clinton, we see it for Obama. That imbalance tends to be roughly 0.2 on this scale, meaning that there's a 20 percentage point gap in mentions. So for instance, if there are 10 candidate mentions, 6 of those are for the incumbent and 4 of those are for the challenger. Now there are 2 outliers. First, in 2016, Trump got incumbent style coverage in terms of imbalance, although he was not the incumbent. Now after that election, there was lots of discussion in the academy, but very publicly amongst journalists and the media as well, expressing a concern that media had focused too much attention on Trump. But now that Trump is the incumbent, we don't see any change in that. We see actually a kind of piling on, an increase in that behavior. Now that he's the incumbent, he's getting entirely outsized proportions of coverage. This year, for every 10 candidate mentions, 7 to 8 of them are Trump, and 2 to 3 of them are Biden. Now, you might say there are differences across newspapers, and those differences, I'm saying, are relatively slight. So here we have 12 newspapers, and this is current up to this past Sunday. This is Labor Day to this past Sunday. And what you see here is coverage in newspapers that varies between about 0.3 and 0.6, hovers around 0.5, and 0.5 reflects on this, by this measure, roughly a 3-to-1 ratio of mentions. That is to say, for every 3 mentions of Trump, there is 1 mention of Biden. Now you might say that that imbalance probably changes over time. I'm saying that imbalance barely changes over time. So here we have 6 weeks of coverage since Labor Day, and save for a blip at the time of the debates, when there is still a large imbalance in Trump's favor, this measure continues to suggest a roughly 3-to-1 ratio of Trump mentions to Biden mentions over the duration of the campaign. Now, one argument would be that because so much Trump coverage is negatively valenced, that the imbalance in coverage I've identified does not necessarily work in his favor. But as our public opinion data show, as in what you've seen in the presentations before mine, and then what you've seen in that graphic on COVID, different partisans see information in different ways. We cannot reasonably assume that coverage of Trump is viewed as negative or positive on average. There will be real heterogeneity in media effects. And given that that is the case, in the meantime, overwhelming coverage of Trump makes it very difficult for citizens to learn about Biden. The nature of media coverage that I have just reviewed makes it possible for voters to decide on whether or not to vote for Trump, but it gives very little information that helps voters decide whether or not to vote for Biden. And to be clear, this imbalance of coverage is evident across media outlets for all of this campaign, and at a rate that is roughly twice as large as we've seen for the last 40 years. I've raced through a fair bit of content there, and I've introduced what I think are some new and peculiar measures of both public opinion and news content. So note that if you want to know more about the methods and analyses related to the CNN breakthrough data, you can find that at s3mc.org, which includes updated charts and blog posts throughout the election, focus on these open-ended responses, more detail on that kind of first part of my storyline. Where the second part on media coverage is concerned, note that the imbalance that I talk about here is just one of several areas in which media can play a critical role in fostering a kind of well-informed citizenry. So at mediafordemocracy.org, which just went live today, you can find a set of recommendations on how to improve coverage of this election, as well as various possible outcomes of this election. This is an open letter signed, co-authored and signed by 60+ professors at 40+ universities who study political communication and journalism. It is, we hope, a useful resource for people interested in the role that media can play at this critical moment in American democracy, both leading up to and following the election. Thanks.
Okay, thank you to our panelists. We have a number of interesting questions. So question number 1, and this goes to any of the panelists. I ask for the panelists to keep their responses relatively brief so we can get through a number of questions. Is there evidence that state level polling is more accurate now than it was in 2016?
Let me say something about that quickly. The others will chime in. We won't know about the accuracy of state level polls until the election occurs and the votes are counted. The pollsters have tried to make adjustments in their methods, but every pre-election pollster applies a set of assumptions about what they think is going to happen, the composition of the electorate and so on. The assumptions they made in 2016 weren't very good. There were some lessons disseminated about the polling in 2016, but we don't know how well they're going to work under these conditions, for example, of attempts to suppress voting.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo a bunch of that. Pollsters have definitely changed what they're doing in response to how they think they fared last cycle. It's commonly the case that the error in one election sort of swaps to slightly the other way in the next election because they overcorrect, though that's definitely not a certainty by any means. And some of the structural issues that were at play in 2016 are still problematic. It is harder to get, rural low education voters in a survey than pollsters would like it to be. And so the ones they get end up in practice counting for more if they're trying to adjust for it. In 2016, there was some problem with the extent to which it was being adjusted for in the first place. And so those questions are I think they're going to remain until we see what the actual results are. And how well likely voter models work, I think Mike is right, is absolutely one of the biggest challenges we're going to have in this cycle, is figuring out who's actually going to vote and who can pick that up correctly given this shift in what voting looks like in the contemporary era. Now, the fact that a lot of people will say that they have already voted may make a difference and may improve accuracy in the last few polls, because from here on out, a decent portion of the public has done so.
Stuart, do you have anything? Okay, lots more questions. So is there going to be a Trump effect where Trump voters say they'll vote for Biden-Harris, but they're really voting for Trump?
It would surprise me. And the reason it would surprise me is because Trump voters tend to be pretty enthusiastically Trump voters. And there's really not much evidence of people lying to pollsters about who they support. Most of the claims for that have not been found when scholars have gone back to look for them.
There is a small question of differential response, not in the nature of the response, but whether the supporters of one candidate are more willing to be interviewed than others. But then, again, as Josh indicated, Trump supporters are more likely to volunteer to be interviewed because of the strength of their support. So the pollsters are keeping their fingers crossed that this won't be an issue in 2020 either.
Okay, are you able to see any impact on people's views, support of Trump as a consequence of the targeted expenditures he's making? For example, the money provided to agriculture of late.
This is not really an area of focus in my research. I couldn't answer that question.
Anybody?
Yeah, I can't tell as well. That wouldn't come up in open-ended responses because we're focused on what gets reported in media. It's an interesting question.
And it's pretty hard to identify, really target demographics and why they're moving and whether it has to do with a particular message. I mean, it's something that I think we're gonna all try to dig into to some degree post-election, but at this point, things are too fast moving to really establish much on that front.
Do you think you will be able to disentangle, this was for Stuart mainly, disentangle the extent to which different perceptions of positive or negative coverage of a candidate by different parties are due to hearing different news or reacting differently to the same news? Could you test this experimentally?
Yeah, so we can test it experimentally. It's difficult to get at out there in the real world, but experimentally, what we see is the tendency basically for motivated reasoning, for a kind of interpretation of an event or a discounting of a interpretation of a piece of information or a discounting of that piece of information in order for that information to not make you question your predispositions, the policy position you already had. And so there's lots of work on that. The reason that I think that that's what's going on out there in reality, above and beyond the fact that I believe that the experiments are externally valid, is that we know that although Fox News, for instance, is the most watched cable news network, it is still not as watched as any of the three major networks' evening news broadcasts, and lots of people are getting their news from a very diverse set of online sources and from newspapers and so on. So it seems to me that the kind of disjuncture that we see in public attitudes in response to, for instance, COVID, that's not driven, it can't be driven exclusively, or even I think primarily, by experiencing different news sources with different stories. It is in all likelihood more about the inclination to interpret events in ways that are strategically advantageous for the individual.
This is a related question, and I think this is probably a tough one. When partisans are exposed to media coverage from the other side, how likely are they to change their mind about the relevant policies?
So I think that's a great question, and I think it's one of the things we really need to get to. I've seen a little bit of evidence, though not enough that I can sort of point to, this is where you should go look for it, that perhaps the primary effect of seeing a bunch of stuff on the other side in the current moment when we're this polarized is that people just think the other side is crazy and discredits them even more. Because the extent of the gap between what is the really right-wing media and the sort of center to left of the rest of the media is huge. And there's nothing in between that seems to validate either one. And so the messages really are pretty starkly different. So if it's somebody who really mostly sees one of those and not the other, and then you expose, it sounds like it's just coming from nowhere.
Without oversimplifying things too much, people who focus on these kinds of issues usually juxtapose a theory of Bayesian updating and the theory of motivated reasoning. And the first model says we take in new information, we adjust our beliefs and positions accordingly, taking it as fact. And the model of motivated reasoning says that we discount information that conflicts with the views that we already hold. And in fact, the people who hold those views most strongly or are most knowledgeable are most likely to reject it. So there's a lot of evidence suggesting that motivated reasoning is at work in a lot of processes that involve political information or the reception or responsiveness to new political information. So I think it makes the kind of behavioral response that's suggested unlikely.
Here's a practical question. How will networks and others try to predict the outcome on election night, especially with respect to mail-in ballots?
So this is actually a touchy point right now, given there was a letter from a bunch of former American Political Science Association presidents that got published in The Guardian, oddly recommending something that is already happening to a large degree, which is that there are political scientists and other scholars from related fields who work at the decision desks at a bunch of these networks, and in many places were invited to do so following the debacle of the 2000 election. Those individuals get a whole bunch of different sources of data to try to evaluate what's going on in the individual states. So one thing that they have is they have the exit polling data, and they know which precincts those specific exit polls come from. So they're able to check the exit polling data against the precinct level data to see if things are matching up in the way they expect. They're looking at who's returning what kinds of what kinds of returns are coming in, both from mail-in ballots of various sorts versus early voting versus in-person voting. And they're going to try to model out what that might imply for various demographic groups, as well as what that might imply for, you know, what's happening in each location, to figure out if the results they're seeing are sort of partial or complete in any given area. And then conditional on things matching up enough that they can feel fairly sure about what hasn't come in, they'll try to make a call. But the really big question this year is going to be about the states where a bunch of stuff is likely to come in after Election Day, how exactly those get handled. And most likely many of those, if they don't look like they're an overwhelming win, are just going to be waited on by the networks, because the worst thing the networks can do for their own credibility is make a bad call.
Mike showed very large differences in candidate choice by mail-in versus in-person voting. Is the differential preference among Democrats to vote by mail something new for this election?
Well, let me say a couple of things about this. First of all, voting by mail has been spreading across the United States as well as early voting. So I believe the figure is that in 2016, 42% of the votes were cast before Election Day. So there are some estimates now that the proportion of non-in-person Election Day votes could go up to 60%. There seems to be a partisan difference, partly because the Democrats are emphasizing to get a ballot early and to cast it by mail or to drop it off in person. And it's not so much that, I wouldn't say it's that Democrats prefer voting by mail or early. It's that people who are supporting Biden and want to believe that their vote is going to be counted, and who don't want to stand in line for hours, because one consequence of the voter suppression techniques is to increase line length by reducing the number of precincts or reducing the number of machines per precinct. So they're voting earlier. It's important to remember that when you vote, your vote is secret, although many election administration officials have information about, for example, party registration that depends upon jurisdiction. There are private firms that collect and assemble data that label registration by party. So the information that we have is about partisans who requested ballots, but not about their vote exactly. And of course, that's part of the complication of assessing what the impact of this might be. But Democrats are clearly, in the states where this is being made available, just in the last week, Democrats are much more likely to have asked for ballots than Republicans.
Facebook and Twitter have implemented measures intended to discourage the spread of misinformation. Is there any indication that these are working?
I don't think we would see those directly in our data, at least in the data that we've presented here. Although there are opportunities in the breakthrough data to explore the degree to which misinformation gets recalled or not. And there's some work underway on that, but nothing as of yet.
Anybody else?
I don't think we're gonna actually get the right data to ever determine that empirically.
Has a candidate behind by 10% with 3 weeks to go ever come back to win?
We're out of sample on so many factors in this election. I wouldn't want to make a strong forecast about that. But I can't, that would be an out of sample case. So I don't believe anybody has shifted by that much, that late, that we've actually had decent data for. But the problem is, we've never had a major election like this in the middle of a pandemic, with the kinds of partisan differences that we're seeing in terms of how people are voting and when people are voting. So who knows?
I mean, one could imagine things that could happen. I mean, suppose the president had been hospitalized 4 days before election day, October 30th. So part of the reluctance to guess about the impact of events is that we're now getting used to events that we never even thought were possible having some probability of taking place. So it's hard to figure. I guess I would add one other point, which is about enthusiasm for the candidate you support, which is related to turnout differential. The Trump supporters are more enthusiastic about voting for Donald Trump than the Biden supporters are in terms of voting for Biden. I mean, this may be only a rough measure, but the survey data suggests that the Biden voters are voting against Trump more than they are in support of Biden, whereas the Trump supporters are dyed-in-the-wool supporters. And we don't know how this will affect turnout between now and November 3rd.
This is mainly for Stuart, I think. Where do the political ads fit into media content, to your media content?
They don't at all. So I'm looking at articles in the focus on media coverage. I'm looking only at articles that are produced by those newspapers. So the ads don't find their way in there a bit. The ads may filter through the open-ended responses, and as in people may recall advertised information as part of what they have read, seen, or heard about the candidate, but it wouldn't come through in the media coverage.
Okay, I'll ask one more question. There's a number of good questions, and I apologize for those that I wasn't able to ask all of them. But this, I think, is a good one to end on. What particular toss-up states should we be watching for on election night and the days thereafter to give us hints of who will likely win if the outcome of the election drags past election night?
That's a prediction I'm not prepared to make.
I mean, the first thing you want to ask is sort of who's going to have results that actually say everything about what's happening there, as opposed to results that are going to be partial within jurisdiction, right? And so I don't know the specifics of how every state and every locality does that, but that's the bit you want to be attending to. In Florida, I know they're able to process a lot of the mail-in ballots earlier. And so those are likely to appear alongside the in-person results on election night. And if you see Florida and Arizona both going to Biden, that would be a pretty strong sign, for instance, that things are not going to last all that long. Beyond that, I think my sense is that, of the sort of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin set, Michigan is probably going to be the most likely to have all of those results showing up at around the same time, though there will be some potential for additional mail-in ballots to keep coming in. Most of them get directly added to the tally, and Michigan is more careful, to my knowledge, about not certifying, about how the results get presented from the individual precincts, such that the precincts have to report all of their results, not just the in-person results, compared to other states that may not do that. In part, I think, because Michigan changed the law to allow a lot more absentee voting, not just because of the pandemic, but a little earlier. But I think these are going to be the messy questions that we're going to have to see, because it really depends on how well the counting goes and how organized some of these states are.
Let me just add to what Josh said, that first of all, it's important to emphasize that we don't have national elections. We have a series of state and local elections held more or less on the same day. And that accounts for the variation in procedures. And, there's a lot of contention among administrators as well as partisans about the rules. In Michigan, we have a rule that mail-in votes can't be counted until 7 a.m. on election day. But the governor has given the Secretary of State permission to start the day before on Monday. That's a kind of a local modification because of a concern about the volume. So I think that is partially the explanation for what Josh is saying about the likelihood that Michigan will have a pretty good total pretty quickly. The states that were always important in the Eastern time zone, Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, which are keys to an electoral college majority, will still be important states to focus on this year, if they can get the totals out in a reasonable period of time. But, you know, there's a basic contest here between trying to ensure integrity and validity of the vote and taking time to count accurately and trying to produce something for television on election night.
Okay, I want to thank Professors Traugott, Soroka, and Pasek for their in-depth look at the upcoming election. Thanks to everybody for joining. We had over 170 participants today. The video from the presentation will be available on the ISR website, as are the three previous presentations in this series. Please join us next week on Thursday, October 22nd at 4 p.m. for a presentation from three more colleagues from the Center for Political Studies who will discuss the upcoming election. The ISR Development Office and Communications Office will send information about next week's events in case you'd like to join us. Thank you again.